Good morning. My name is Joshua Fraustro from MAST on behalf of the P3T. And I'll be going over some of the technical changes, the exact specifics of what we'd like to see as part of this protocol transition. It's going to be really hard to summarize 5 months of some really great work in 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. You've heard a lot of my colleagues discuss in their own talks mentions of OpenAPI, like we just did, and protocol transition. So the best place to start is, what is OpenAPI? So OpenAPI is an industry standard way to describe a web service, to describe an API. It's a standardized language agnostic interface, really easy to read. I think the tagline they use is human readable and machine readable, either in JSON or YAML. We picked YAML just because it's frankly easy to read. And use it to define the API endpoints, requests and responses, payloads and schemas, essentially everything you need for the basic structure of any web service. And this is an industry standard tool. It's been around for over a decade now with a huge ecosystem of tools and editors and validators that all support it. We've specifically been using OpenAPI 3.0. There's some really cool features in 3.10 we'd love to work with, but we'll get there when we feel comfortable. So what does an OpenAPI specification look like? We chose UWS because it's sufficiently complicated enough to not be trivial, and because the messages to and from the server and client are basically all protocol. There's no real data there. It's something that can be easily defined through a data model. So we want to describe our API. Well, let's logically start with the paths and operations. So this is UWS. So the root level is your job list. You can use gets and posts to get the job list and create a new job. Job ID there in the curly braces would be getting the job summary that you've created. You've got get, post, and delete, as you might expect. And you'll need to define parameters for your endpoint. So you do it underneath the operation level. You say this, for example, phase is for polling the job summary as it changes. You say, okay, that's going to be in the query. Similarly, there'll be one for the job ID in the path. And you say, okay, that's a simple string. And you can even go so far as to enumerate allowed values. Pending, queued, executing are all valid for phase in this instance. And then you've got description that can be used for auto documentation and even just readability within the text. And you can define your responses, and they're done by status code quite sensibly. 200 for success, 401 for unauthorized, and 404, et cetera. And you would need to define what the response is going to be, what the body of it will be. You might notice in this case, we don't have like an actual definition here. We've got a reference, and that comes in quite handy because this is a reference to another section of this document, the job summary component. We can describe as an object what the job summary looks like without defining it as an XML document or JSON specifically. You can say that a job summary has a job ID and that's a string. You can give examples and describe it. Run ID, similarly. Execution duration would be an integer, and so on and so forth. And so these don't map one-to-one, but this is essentially a type-hinted description of the equivalent semantically version of that document. And what is really neat is that with some versions of OpenAPI, the newest ones, this doesn't need to be in the same document as the rest of those, the schema definition. So if you think about maybe versioning and importing components from another document, we'll get there because you're absolutely right. So what are we actually proposing with these documents? Well, that new and updated standards within the IVOA be described come with an OpenAPI specification for them. And like Janet mentioned, these standards are going to be broken from now on into 2 documents, theoretically. A narrative one, that's background, use cases, motivations, everything that's not directly part of the standard. And then you'll have the technical one. That'll be the OpenAPI specification. But because that document can't describe everything, you'll have the behavior of the service. Is an endpoint blocking or is it non-blocking? Is there, there's an optional parameter, does something special happen when you provide that? Anything that is not quite literally described by the OpenAPI specification, you write out here. The standards process will remain much the same. You'll still go through the process of evaluations and feedback. You'll have your reference implementations and your validators, but it'll be more technically described by these documents we're providing. What are the implications of this? Well, you get shorter, simpler standards documents. On the right here, I have an excerpt from the current standard listing out all of the URLs and endpoints for the UWS spec. You don't need that anymore. It's in the document. All of these parameters and endpoints become, for the most part, self-documenting. And even more so when you take into consideration auto-documentation tools that can generate this in a really nice graphical way. Explanations in the technical document will be reserved for those non-obvious things like I mentioned. And generally what you'll see is a removal of ambiguity in these operations. What operations happen on which endpoints, get which parameters, and you get what payloads and responses. It's clear and explicit. An example I have here is a section from the current UWS document. Certain of the UWS's resources accept post and delete. That's very good to mention, and some of those parameters are mentioned explicitly, but not all of them. In the OpenAPI doc, you can quite literally see which ones get post, which ones get put, and it makes a lot more clear. There's another example down here. Most of the cases where a job sub-object is set, the response will have an HTTP 303 status code. You don't need to describe that anymore. It's under the endpoint. You can see it there. You can remove huge sections of these documents that don't substantively add anything that is already described by the OpenAPI spec. I say error responses here, but they can be any responses. So you can define, for example, that 303 responds one time at the bottom of the document and just reference it everywhere that you expect that to happen. The schemas, the payloads that are currently all XML documents, are now language agnostic. They're defined as essentially code objects. So whether they be returned as XML or JSON, I would prefer, that becomes a code implementation, right? That's content negotiation. You have the structure there. Whatever it comes out with as it's formatted is whatever you want it to be. And like I mentioned, if, for example, you need to use UWS and TAP, you take all of the components that you've described in the UWS spec, let's say 1.1, and you can just import them, pull them into your TAP document. Now, what does that mean? Well, things are going to break and things are going to have to change. And many of these are for very good reasons. Something that is important is that OpenAPI is fairly strict about good HTTP practices. And so we're going to have to go through these specs and avoid what I call anti-patterns here. And now I've been somewhat reductive here in saying that if something isn't easy to do in OpenAPI, you probably shouldn't do it. But the truth is that that's more applicable to all of the standards and HTTP protocols. DALI specifies case-insensitive parameters, which is not something typical in HTTP, and it's nearly impossible to do in OpenAPI. So the natural conclusion is, should we be doing that at all? This is also a great opportunity to fix a number of the security issues that Russ Albry has brought up many times with our current standards. We can take care of that while we're doing this. And like I alluded to, we can move towards supporting modern serialization formats. The truth is, many folks love XML, and there's some very good reasons to do so. But the support for it in modern languages and frameworks is becoming more and more spotty. JSON is sort of the industry standard right now. But like I said, we're not defining it as JSON even specifically. This is just an object that we can spit out however we want. We won't be strictly bound to XML anymore in the future either way. And I make a note here because people get a little hand-wringy when you talk about moving to JSON. We're not changing the VO table. That is quite wildly out of spec for what we want to do. And in fact, we can leave things much like they are by just saying, hey, by the way, this endpoint is going to return an XML string, and you can leave it at there. You can then document that in the technical spec and say, yes, it's a VO table. So the immediate benefits, like Janet mentioned, these are clear and simpler standards. We'll have that modularity I discussed of being able to import definitions from other specs. And the most important thing to me here is this developer spin-up time. If you take any software developer out of industry and bring them into your institution, are they going to have like a super fun time trying to write your TAP service? And the answer is probably not, because I was in that situation a year and a half ago. You are looking at for example, in UWS, a 22-page academic text describing in natural language what this service should do. When you have, for example, an OpenAPI specification, you don't get the entire behavior of the service, but you get 50% of the way there. And you can sit down your new hire in front of this technical document and say, can you at least get all these endpoints here? Can you get these parameters in place? Can you describe these objects? And that becomes far simpler. And you don't need a deep understanding of DALI, and all these related specs to at least start on that work. To begin writing a UWS service as a new hire, yeah, you can read that document, but you're going to need to go into DALI and find out how all of these parameters work, how VASI works, and it's a huge burden to work with. You'll get clear and obvious definitions for every parameter and payload. I've mentioned that. There are ambiguities within certain responses. Well, should this be an XML document? Can this be just plain text? And that becomes explicitly defined by necessity. And like I mentioned, we have the flexibility for future serialization methods. So I know some of you like to, for whatever reason, program in just like text editors. But for the rest of us spoiled folk out there, there are these really fantastic tools that support this. Almost all modern IDEs have OpenAPI extensions or plugins that will let you really easily organize your document, test them out within your editor against a server you define. And even more than that, and it's really small, but mine in VS Code has an option called audit, which will quite literally let you run this section of an endpoint against, I think it's something like 400 validators for HTTP best practices. It can't cover everything. It can't know, what behavior you're doing on the back end, but it can at least, cut off some errors before they really get bad. And for folks who want to do stuff online, this is a Swagger editor for OpenAPI. You can define and work with your schema on the left, and auto-generated in real time on the right will be all of the Swagger docs with examples as you fill them out. And you can quite literally hit try this out and point it as server and change parameters and see, make sure it actually works sensibly. This is something that is icing on the cake. It's not super important for what we're doing here, but it is really cool in that Swagger and many of the other OpenAPI supporting techs and projects have server and client generators. So if for whatever reason you're a small institution and you don't have like the manpower to start from scratch, or for whatever reason you can't use one of the off-the-shelf ones, this isn't going to fill out everything you need to do. You need to plug in your data, you need to plug in the service behavior, but it'll get you like 50% of the way there. And that saves a lot of time and overhead. And additionally, you get client generators. One of the ones I have here is Swift. So, if someone wants to make an iPhone tap app, like, go for it. That would be cool. Again, these generators don't, we've all worked with auto-generated code. It's a little ugly, but you go in there, you clean up, and you have your tap service, or you have your UWS service, at least 50% of the way there. Oh, by the way, if your app serves Swagger docs, ours do it masked because we use Fast API in Python, you might already have an OpenAPI definition for your service. If you see a page like that, you might see a little OpenAPI link there. And this is off our cone search application. I didn't touch this at all for the prototyping we were doing, but you click on that, you download the JSON, and there it is. Like I said, the pathing is a little ugly, the naming is a little gross, but there you go. That's your OpenAPI doc, and you can go through that and clean that up if you want to make it a standard. Long-term benefits. This is the stuff I'm really, really interested in. If you have machine-readable standards and you have tools to validate against, you can automate testing of these standards through CI/CD. So you're working on the next specification of DALI, you make a branch, you push that branch. Well, now there's a Christmas tree of errors that have all popped up and all the relevant standards that you've broken because you changed a parameter. Knowing that ahead of time, not relying on editors farther down the pipeline process or the approval process is really, really valuable. You don't get the issue that, a standard 3 or 4 versions down the line has made everything incompatible. You also get standards code coverage in that you can take those reference implementations that people give you, the validators that they provide, and test them against the standards they're claiming. It's not going to be perfect, but you'll be able to cover a lot of the basic use cases that way. You'll get consistency between service providers. When we all have something concrete to match against, it becomes a lot easier to work with. Lower barrier to entry, like I mentioned, and it'll be easier to update with further specs. So this is my, it's going to be okay section. Nothing is going away tomorrow with these proposed changes. Like Janet said, we're going to have prototypes, we'll have implementation phases, we'll have parallel services. MAST has, well, let me clarify. I have dedicated MAST to running a parallel service whenever we get there. And And there will be breaking changes, and there always are with these standards updates. But I honestly think they're not going to be as bad as we think. You know, getting rid of an endpoint here or there is not going to be the end of the world. And they're going to be easier to update than before. There'll be clear and explicit documents we can go to change some parameters. And most importantly, we're not going into this alone. Like Janet mentioned again, we have these institutions that are backing up our claims, that are that believe this is important enough that we're going to spend the time to work on it. OpenAPI is proven tech. There's a huge ecosystem supporting it. I mean, commercial industries like I think eBay has supported OpenAPI published documentation for 8 years now. And if they can do it, some of the most influential scientific organizations in the world, I think, can put it together as well. So yeah, there's a rich ecosystem of tools and development behind it. And I want to say that, like I said, we're not going into this alone. It's going to be scary, but like all things we do in the IVOA, we're going to do it together. And I think it's going to be great. So thank you.
Is there a way in which these JSON documents can be referenced in the corresponding prose write-up in a way that you don't have to duplicate chunks of them? Are they going to be sort of considered separate documents? Because I know right now a lot of these are just defined in these sort of prose documents, but now there's going to be a supplementary JSON file. So how do those two things interact in this new way of doing things?
Sure. I mean, in the ideal scenario, I'd like to keep the repetition between both of the documents to a minimum, especially within the sort of technical explanatory document. In the past, standards have done terrible things like copy and pasting an entire XSD into the PDF. I'd like to avoid that entirely. How we're going to distinctly link between, for example, an explanation and the line item, line number 90 within the JSON document, I'm not sure of, and I almost don't want to put a specific on that, especially if things get reordered or changed. It might suffice for the first draft to just sort of list out the endpoint and then describe the behavior underneath it. And a reader should be sufficiently aware looking at the companion specification that this applies to this. The exact formatting of how that document's going to look is still very much up in the air, but it's something we can work on, absolutely.
I just can add to that, it's possible to have a document production system that merges that doesn't have a duplication of the authoritative source of the text, but renders the formal definition of the standard into the same web page or PDF or whatever that you want to just read. So like the Rubin documentation system does that. If you look at the the Butler documentation, there are a lot of command line commands in there, and all of their command line command help gets merged into the web pages for documentation automatically. It isn't copied by hand. It's just automatically done by the production system. Alberto was waiting.
I will show all my ignorance about this thing. There was one sentence, Gregory, in your presentation: form parameter service invocations will not be available for new services. What does that really mean? And what are the implications of that? I really want to understand fully this one. Thanks.
I think this is especially true for post invocations.
Sure. I mean, the simplest version of this, and Russ Albury, if he's talked online, he's done a lot of great write-ups on the security implications of it, but simple post form encoded requests are quite susceptible to CSRF, cross-site request forgery attacks. There is some technical details about them being not checked by pre-flight between the client and the server. And that's sort of something that has been known for a long time within HTTP development, and we should eliminate that as soon as possible, especially if we're making all this effort to move to modern development principles anyway. What the implications of that will be for clients and for users, I hope are minimal, but that is the technical reason why we want to move away. A post would not be possible, and as a matter of, again, a security issue, state changing gets, we should also get rid of. But yeah, a simple get should be fine. Yes, you would do post with. No, yes, absolutely correct.
Just want to repeat that.
Yeah, it's just standard HTTP protocol. We're not deviating from anything. Yeah.
Updating to like current, best practices.
Yes. So I'll go over here next.
Ouais. So,
Yep. Yep.
Laurent Michel from Strasbourg. I was wondering why changing the formalism of the API, moving to OpenAPI, require to change the client code we are running now, because the standard doesn't change in this sense.
I'll start that, and Joshua can comment on it as well. We were just actually partly explaining why. So it's partly because we're currently not doing some things correctly the way that the standards have been used in terms of how we use HTTP requests, how we map the things that we do onto the HTTP verbs, onto get and post and put and delete. And that has security implications, and it also has implications for correct cacheability of responses to queries and things like that. So it's important when you're trying to proxy requests through proxies at the borders of science platforms. There are a whole host of reasons why this matters. So that's probably the most important reason. The other is just when we go and we look at each one of these standards and write a formal specification for it, we're going to find that it was full of ambiguities. It always is. If you don't have a formal specification, there are ambiguities. They're going to get resolved, and we're going to find that they don't fall out exactly as everybody maybe thought that they were supposed to, or we're going to have to find half the implementations did it this way and half of them did it that way, and we're going to have to pick a winner. Those kinds of things will happen when you go to a rigorous machine readable formal specification. So I think it's just inevitable that will happen. So, and Joshua said, this is the time to clean up our security situation. And it's just really unavoidable at this point to try to start tackling that.
And just from sort of the changes that might come to clients that use these protocols, the changes are, the depth of them will be sort of unknown until we sort of complete these specifications. But I mean, for example, like the ones we've just touched on, they're going to be simple things like, okay, you can't use a form post anymore. I believe in the genius of many of our client developers to be able to accommodate that, especially with help from us. And changing the state of a UWS job with a get, you make that a post. I think the current standard allows for that anyway, so that's a fairly minor adaptation to make. I don't see there will be, of course, be an impact to the clients, and we'll have to work with them on that. But I don't envision it being a rewriting all of PyVO kind of issue.
Mark, you had a question?
Yes, thanks. I have a question about ongoing standards development. So assuming that you go ahead and rewrite TAP to use this new OpenAPI way of doing things, is the intention then for further versions of the TAP standard after that, TAP 1.2 or whatever it is, to be developed in two separate tracks, one in the old way and one in the new way, or to move just to using OpenAPI for future versions of TAP and other standards that are doing this?
I think our intent is that if the sort of phase one is successful, then we would move forward in just the new way of defining the standard. Because having parallel standards is probably going to be unsustainable for the effort we have available within the community.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. I mean, an implication of that is that if you are a service provider operating an existing tap service and you want to use whatever new features come out in tap 1.2, then it's not sustainable. It's not possible for you to keep your existing implementation and just fiddle around with it a bit. You're going to have to completely rewrite it in the OpenAPI way, which wasn't emphasized in the kind of compatibility points that you're making.
Yeah, I think that's something we're going to have to explore as part of the prototyping about what, how far we can support those sort of things and what the transition looks like for existing services. It's a really important thing.
I would also just sort of very minorly quibble about the term rewriting. I see it very, and this is the way I've committed to doing this for MAST, is I can see it being very probable to essentially copy our current TAP I know this is not going to apply to every service provider, but copy our current TAP implementation and make these small changes. The ones that we've bumped into thus far, like have been mentioned a few times, are quite small now, and they will, of course, get larger and larger as we continue development in this new format. But I would not say rewrite is the encompassing verb there.
I also want to add to that. None of us have really said this, and it's a sort of an informal commitment, not a, there's no rule that says this, but I don't think any of us are eager to do what you might think of as like take advantage of the situation to just sort of like slip in a bunch of changes to the standard at the same time, right? We're trying to take what we have that's known to work, migrate it to the new form, clean up things that need to be cleaned up because they're actually ambiguous. That's the main focus. When it comes to TAP, there is a TAP 1.2 in flight already, and I think this is one of the things that we'll have to grapple with in the phase 1 period, is whether existing TAP 1.2 work continues because it's already started, or whether it gets sucked into this. But for I think that's a unique case because TAP is the pilot project. Going forward, I don't think that's I don't think we'll have the same challenges probably. I wasn't keeping track of in order. We might go up the back there.
Thank you for the interesting work. Has the team considered containerization as part of their approach in terms of implementing some IVOA services like TAP? Having a containerized example is very valuable. We found that for the CDS implementation of TAP, implementing that at Data Central was really easy once the containerized example was available. And it would also help with CI/CD and writing tests that run against an example implementation.
Everything that you said is true, but it's orthogonal to this project. I don't think it's part of this project to do that. I mean, I'll tell you, like, my own attitude from Ruben, and people who've heard some of my other remarks this week will remember this. That is exactly what the community needs, is containerized, robust implementations that are readily reusable. I know that CADC is working towards a more polished containerized version of their TAP service. It already is containerized, and we use it in Ruben, but I think they're doing some work to make it a little bit easier for outside projects to reuse. Similarly for the one that we develop as part of the UWS that we're going to develop as part of this project in Ruben will absolutely be open source and containerized and on automatic CI/CD and pushed to a registry on a regular basis. That's just the way we do work these days, and I think that's it fits well with this, but it's not part of this.
I mean, no, you said it. It would be really cool. I'd love it, but definitely not within the scope of the work for this team.
Thank you.
First, thanks for the job. I'm really happy to see the things coming out. where it's kind of impulse of a new evolution of standards. When do you think you will get back to the working group to put this impulse, because all these standards are related to working group? Where do you want to join them to make benefits of what you have started, so they can all follow what you are doing, and even they can motivate them to participate?
So our thoughts was on I said originally, we set this up for just to go on from January to this interop. When we met a few days ago, we realized that if we made stronger statements than we are right now, we wouldn't have given ourselves that prototype phase that we just described. So I think we leave it within this group over the summer, but people can join and listen in and participate. But we kind of lined up the folks that are going to be, making the changes, which we thought was an important thing coming out of this meeting. So I think the tipping point to get people more involved is to listen to the results of this phase one at the next interop and then go forward from there, or stop. That was how we outlined things, that phase one goes to the next interop. And then we present again all of the information, all of the prototypes, the pros and cons, and we make a decision as a community to go forward or to stop.
And just to be clear, right, the decision's not like right when we report, right? We don't like report at the next interop and you vote, right? That's the idea is that then a normal process happens of processing this through our mechanisms.
Initial comment is awesome. Like, I think it's a great idea. Question, I'm just curious, do you have a solid scope boundary where you say, no, we're not going to do certain changes, but we will do other changes in terms of consistency and stuff? So, for example, if among all of the different services, there are some endpoints that kind of do similar things, but at the moment the names are crazy different or just inconsistent in terms of a nomenclature and terminology, will you use this as an opportunity to clean that up as well? Or is that sort of out of scope because it's too much of a breaking change?
I mean, we've started working on UWS and tablets in this group. My personal opinion, and we're going to go back and forth on this on how to do it. I don't think now is the time to start changing what endpoints exist. I think cleaning things up, getting them prepared and sort of up to modern standards is the first step. I wouldn't want to go removing entire endpoints that people expect to be there as the first thing we present. Maybe at some point down the line where we can all go, we've got this really cool thing now, it all works great, and now we can, I think we actually mentioned this as part of phase 2 of pulling out common denominators within these services and looking at ways we can clean that kind of thing up.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on the questions. The first comment is congratulations. I think it's a really good idea and also very good approach. So I want to explicitly thank you for these two things. I mean, I feel it's a very mature proposal, so I like very much the approach. I mean, clearly it's a significant evolution of the existing IVOA standards, but the way you've presented it is a very mature approach, this phased approach that I could strongly feel that there are data centers and VO publishers behind this proposal. You know that we will all have to evolve our publishing services, and clearly it was very good, very well presented here. So many thanks. I mean, it's really congratulations to the whole team. It's really good.
Thank you very much.
My question is a bit maybe technical here. I think is in the registry of obviously when you're going to adapt. I mean, we're going to build these new services. So how will we define them in the registry?
I kind of hinted at that in my presentation, but we haven't solved that problem yet. That's part of what needs to be done in phase 1. But we recognize that there is a registry question that goes to this question of how a client knows which service invocation method it should use, for instance. So yeah, we'll have to deal with that. And just to go back to the previous question, I just want to basically agree with what was said. I think in the course of phase one, I suspect we will get some insights as to what things should be pulled down into DALI and VOSI that might, help to have a more uniform basis for the collection of standards as they get migrated going forward. But like, we don't know what those answers are yet.
Okay, so firstly, again, thanks for the approach, but I'm also obliged to push back just a little bit here, because the reaction in some of the teams who build tools like Aladdin with tens of years of development that's gone in there, and I would really encourage, because it's a little bit of a surprise that there's so much impact on the client. So I think there's perhaps the pros and cons from the client point of view perhaps have not been looked at in detail. So I'm really trying to highlight that if we're going to put forward tools like TopCat and Aladdin and others like Firefly as good examples of what we do with the VO, let's be really clear about talking to the developers of those tools to understand what the impact is, because there's really a lot inside those things, and there's lots of good ideas you've put forward. I'm not going to talk to them technically, but please let's understand the impact on those and what it might look like in a year or two's time, with that different idea that you query things in two different ways. And in terms of security topics, I'm just a bit surprised when some of those things come up. Maybe it's something that comes through science platforms, but I don't think there are security issues about the way Aladdin and TopCat work. But perhaps you have some initial comments about that, and I encourage a more deeper discussion with the application developers.
Yeah, I'll respond a little bit there. I suppose I could have been a little bit more explicit about it, but I think you'll recall I did try to say part of phase one is to understand the implications for all those clients. It is definitely on the radar screen, right? We were sort of scrambling until quite recently to just put together the story that we have here. I felt it was premature to go do the poll and work with all the teams, but I think that is part of the next step, is to understand, is this a realistic ask? And that's why I highlighted that's the big ask, right? So I'm not trying to hide the ball. That's going to be the hard thing in order to make this transition. And if the resources aren't available, or if it's harder than we recognize right now, we need to know that. That's really critical. I mean, I just to be, for full disclosure, I haven't discussed this with the Firefly team, right? So, this is right. We're taking this one step at a time. That's what this next phase is about. Yeah.
What I think will also be incredibly valuable for, I don't know the details of every individual client out there and how their code base works, but what I think will be valuable is that the end result of at least the phase one will be this incredibly technical document, which at least will outline, will have been able to take notes throughout this process and say, this explicit endpoint, here's the exact behavior that's going to change. This endpoint, you can't do this anymore, but here's exactly the way you'll do it in the future. And that will exist through future code changes, future standard changes. You can really, quite literally, if you want to, run a git diff against, the standard and see exactly which operations change with what parameters. So I would hope that at the end of phase one, the result will be that those changes are less nebulous and are quite clear, and we can pass back to clients. And then the evolving hope that they will continue to be even more clear as standards update.
So I have a question with my chair of semantics hat. So I'm completely ignorant of how OpenAPI works and the payloads are formed, and so, but yeah, if it's possible, I would like to see in phase one an example of how it connects with the vocabularies we have in semantics. Since in all the move that we are doing now is that we take all the control value lists of the standards and put it in semantics, which I think is very good. But I hope that in this new framework, we can use those vocabularies as a source of information for the queries and the results, and it has to be formally declared in those specification, technical specifications. So I'd like to see in the phase one implementation something that shows how it works.
I mean, yeah, maybe one of the other folks here can speak to it a little more formally, but I'm going to shoot from the hip here. I don't see why we wouldn't be able to do something like that. But again, maybe someone else can sort of answer the question from a more executive level than I am. I think that would be good.
I welcome the folks from the semantics group to join the process, to watch it. But I think we have to consider all of those things. And if it doesn't include things and people have gaps that when we get to the next interop, because, you know, the summer goes by fast and that's part of my concern, then we have to take another step where we look at the parts that might have been missing. That makes sense.
I think what you're asking for is extremely well aligned with the goals of what we're trying to do, of turning informal vocabularies that live, you know, distributed across many English language documents into formal vocabularies. That's the name of the game.
Yeah, indeed. What I'm saying is, are you able to use URIs of terms that are coming from an ontology?
So I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's
so
the question.
So, you know, whether it's easy to use the exact form in which you're currently building these dictionaries, or whether we need to run a translation script or something like that in order to put it in a form that OpenAPI can use, that's a technical question. But I think it's only a technical question. I mean, I just don't see any conceptual obstacle. The main thing that we would probably have to deal with isn't that. It's like the chain of configuration control to like figure out like if that comes from a repo, like what tag of that repo are we using and to make the standard from and so on. So that's the kind of work that would have to be done rather than like some like big picture problem. The big picture answer is yes to your question. We will figure out how to make that work because it's the right thing to do.
If you'd like to come join, you know, you can help us figure it out.
I mean, it may be, I mean, that's not like, that's not a reckless suggestion. It's possible that this is a sufficiently key point that, you know, maybe we would like to involve, just like we want to talk to the client teams, right? That we need to involve you more explicitly in coming up with an answer for that to be ready for the next round of discussions.
A technical curiosity, you said that you will start with the TAP, and TAP involves many other standards. So UWS was mentioned, but even down to ViewTable. So I would have thought naively that in order to implement this rigorously, you have to have also all the other standards already using OpenAPI, so that you can just import the files from the different standards and have the final TAP implementation, not implementation, but definition. How is going to work without that? Are you doing that or not?
So UWS is a large fraction of that space. We are doing UWS. The other things that you mentioned, there are definitely things in VOSI and in DALI that we depend on. And I would say, I mean, now I'm speaking a little bit more for myself than officially for the team, but I think I probably have this right. Until we've kind of worked through making a TAP service from an OpenAPI spec, we won't be entirely clear about which parts of that spec are the DALI parts that, you know, that need to be imported from someplace that can be used in common. So we're going to use phase one to figure that out. We don't have the answer today. That's why we have another phase coming.
And no, I mean, it's quite a good question. And the answer kind of cheekily is that you can quite naively just define all of the tap service in one big document if you want to. Yeah. That is the big hope that you can you could then make sure everything's, its own little standard and pull it in, have it in version control. But yeah, I mean, we can, and we have demonstrated prototypes, they're kind of messy, right, at the moment, but just having an entire tap service in one document. And that exists even within, I think I mentioned that you might already have an OpenAPI spec. Mass can do that. You can just pull that document down and there you go. It's not going to have all the abstractions, individual little layers of DALI and UWS, but we can do it. And to some degree, it has been done to a little bit of good effect.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, were there any concerns about having to support newer versions of OpenAPI spec as you move forward? I know that you said you were looking at version 3, but as the OpenAPI moves forward, I think version 4 is coming as well. As a service provider using newer technologies, the standard may not necessarily change, but will you have to rewrite the technical standard to align with those?
I mean, this is something we've discussed. Even ideally, at least for the prototype, we've been working with 3.0, and I mentioned that we'd love to move to 3.10 because there's some really cool features. Like I think remote file importing is one. But we think one of the big selling points is that there's still a huge ecosystem supporting 3.0, and there is for 3.2, but to a lesser degree. So looking at something that is as widely already supported as 3.0 and getting the buy-in and showing everyone how easy it is, and then being able to move on further. For one day we describe, we decide we want to do 4.0, or maybe in 5 years OpenAPI isn't whatever we all thought it was cut out to be. Well, now we'll at least have a standards document in place that should be fairly easy to move between whatever the the new cool kid on the block is, if it comes to that.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I just want to say there are several questions I have, but here I try to just filter and just get the important ones. First of all, I think this is a very good proposal as well. I agree with Christophe and with many people here that I think this is the way to go. I get a bit surprised that you want to focus on the clients and not in the server. I am more in the server part because I think Mark Taylor already mentioned that for instance, if you go to a new version, so how do we implement that? We use this OpenAPI or not, and what we do with the old servers. For me, I think this is very, very easy to answer. I think that we try to move already to the OpenAPI. There's a lot of advantage, so no question about that. But in any case, just to be brief here is, do you already think about, for instance, in our case, that we fulfill the standard of the TAP, for instance, the TAP server, but we also include new endpoints that are not in the standard and things like that. Is this easy to do that with OpenAPI? I don't want to touch, for instance, the TAP specification. I want to add some endpoints or some new responses. Can I do that without changing the proposed OpenAPI specification for TAP? Just like inherit, okay, I base on this and I want to add new endpoints. Is this feasible with OpenAPI?
I mean, yeah, there's nothing that's going to penalize your service for having additional endpoints that aren't specified in there, as long as they don't, break or conflict or anything. The only place you would be in a bad way is if you didn't have something there. But if you've implemented your own feature into TAP or what have you, yeah, it's not going to be in the OpenAPI spec. But you're also not going to get, pinged on a validator for, this isn't strictly there. The only place that would get hit is if, the core functionality of TAP isn't there.
But what I mean is I want to still use OpenAPI, even for the new endpoints. This is the point. Can I merge the two solutions in? Okay, the canonical tab plus my extensions in OpenAPI.
I don't have a technical answer to that.
Okay.
That's a good question. We should. I don't know the technical answer. I think Joshua doesn't look like we're sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think we'll take note of that question. It's a good point. If you want to, so just to reiterate, like what I understand the question is, so we'll see if I've understood you correctly. If you want to have another endpoint on the same service that is governed by an OpenAPI spec of yours, and that's running at the same time as the other endpoints on that service that are governed by the TAP OpenAPI spec, is there any technical conflict involved in doing that? And so I don't know the answer to that. We'll figure that out. It's a very good question.
Okay, great. Just a last one is, you already mentioned that because of security reasons, you are not going to allow the post forms. I just wanted to comment that, okay, I need to also look into our server and documentation and technically how we can deal with this. The only thing I want to mention here is that we move in some of the endpoints from the get to the post because we have a limitation in the number of parameters that we could put. So I don't know how to circumvent this or how to solve this, because if it is a problem to move to the post and we need to come back to get, I don't know how to do that.
So, I mean, I guess it's a good time to repeat. There's nothing that we're doing that's forcing you to change a server that's currently working that you're happy with, right? And there's nothing that's going to stop you from adding more features to it of your own. The issue Mark identified is if, that are we going to cut off the development of the old style services once there's a new style one that's been approved? So the security issue, the way this works in the world that I live in, it's all like risk-based management of security, right? You choose to accept a risk or you don't, right? And so we've all chosen to accept the risks that are associated right now with form encoded post requests. Some of us are under pressure to not do that anymore from security reviews and so on. And it isn't a great idea to do in the contemporary security environment. I mean, it's not just security theater. Russ is really good at explaining this. He's one of the people in our team. But like, if your concern is that, like, is it going to be hard to migrate to the new mechanism? Like, at a minimum, you're not really looking at a big wrenching piece of software development to do this. Instead of pulling individual form parameters out of their form encoded thing, you're going to pull them out of a JSON object. But it's not a significantly more difficult piece of code to write, right? I mean, it's not nothing. I'm not telling you there's no work, right? But it's not something extremely opaque, right? It's a simple procedural thing. So I don't think that there should be a lot of fear around the implications of this change.
Okay. Thank you very much. I need to look into that.
Any questions online?
Hi, I just wanted to say nice things. I encourage you to continue this effort. I'm delighted to see it. I went through the same very painful process with the planetary data system over the course of the past 15 years, and it's worth it. A well-defined standard is good for the community. It's good for interoperability. It's good for long-term stability. I encourage you to do it. I wanted to ask you about your timeline. How confident are you that phase 1 will be complete in 6 months? And to a factor, which I realize is just got to be there, what are you thinking the timeline for phase 2 is likely to be?
I guess the 6 months is optimistic, and there is a lot of work to be done. But I think that it's a good opportunity to report back and a good motivating aim. But I don't think anyone can guarantee that, yep, it's all going to be done by then. There's no risks. And as far as the other phases, I think they will play out as is natural. There won't be you can't sort of push them all too fast.
Years, decades,
Probably years rather than
drunken
decades.
weekends.
No, I'll shoot from the hip and say 2 weeks from now. Yeah. Yeah, lock a bunch of developers in a room with some coffee, we'll get it knocked out. But no, I mean, no, the serious answer is just in like the small prototyping we've done between, I think we've done Cone Search, we've messed around with it a little bit. UWS and TAP have had quite a lot of work put into them already. I feel fairly confident that 6 months is a pretty good time frame to have it all wrapped up in a nice little bow, to be able to present. I mean, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be going to a recommendation immediately, but to be able to hand it over and say, hey, take a look. I mean, we think this is pretty good. What do you guys think? I think we can be there. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the work product of phase 1 is a worked example, or three worked examples, with at least 3 services plus 1 client at the moment. It'd be nice if we could get another one. And the document that, as was said, or set of documents that describe the standards themselves and the sort of meta standard for how we will build standards in this mechanism. So that phase 1, yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's also important to recognize the projects that are engaged in this, that are providing resources to them, are pretty strongly motivated because they want this to happen if we can make it happen. So like Ruben's kind of counting on the labor savings from being able to put up, we have a long list of services still to put up in the next couple of years. So there's a very strong motivation on our side to keep this process moving. I don't know what Mast's institutional position is. I know the Mast developers feel a sense of urgency.
I will say that I think if I went back to my team and told them we're going to have to develop against another narrative document again, I think there are people on my team who might outright refuse. So yes, I am also counting very heavily on this turning out really well. Because yeah, I mean, just even from a normal developer perspective, there are a lot of benefits to have. So I mean, yeah, that's my personal perspective as not speaking as representative of Mast, but as a Mast engineer.
And I'll add one thing. When we started, we welcomed other folks to join. So if you've got a niche and you're worried about it, you're more than welcome to join this team and become part of this. The other thing is that James has been our lead chair over this period of 6 months. And, you know, that was his commitment. So now we're looking for a chair to lead this group going forward. So if something like that interests you, to keep this group on schedule and to move things forward and have the technical benefits of, you know, being part of this, you're welcome to come forward too and express that.
Any further questions?
There is a debate on Zoom about CSRF and disagreement as to whether it's worth fixing.
Yeah. Marcus, did you want to summarize the discussion?
No, don't let this confuse you. We're just nerds discussing.
Very good.
Can I ask that the chat be saved, please? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we'll save the chat. Yep. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When you say you're going to be ready to show something in 6 months, does that mean you'll actually have a service that we could hit and experiment with?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think we actually have some of those now, but Russell.
Oh, don't pass that to me. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's the hope. At least for what I want to do with Mast is to, even while we're working on this technical spec, to have, you know, a branch of our TAP service set up and just available even for us while we're working on it to query against.
I think we're going to have running versions long before that. So yeah, and that's going to be part of our conversation with client teams, including the voice I just heard. But certainly in the in the Ruben context, when Russ and the rest of us are working on building these prototypes, we're going to just deploy them in the integration cluster of the Ruben Science Platform. So they'll be there. It'll be easy to access those from within, at least.
Does that mean we're going to try to have a couple, one from Mast and one from Ruben?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a question that I can't answer right now is, we have a walled garden in our integration cluster, so I have absolutely no hesitation putting a running service up there and letting whoever currently has access put it up. I don't know how Mast is going to feel about people from outside pinging a new service. So yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here, you could say this on the mic. Let me get you on the record.
Mast can deploy a test version of this to our test servers, which are publicly accessible.
Thank you very much.
So at CDC, we'll do one prototype and we can deploy it, make it publicly accessible. Probably not in the registry until we sort out those details. Depending on details and effort, we may be able to also deploy like a prototype version of UCAT with user catalogs and stuff, and in addition to the COM one, but I would probably target the COM database initially.
Thank you.
All right, we'll call it there. Thank you very much, everyone, for your involvement and enthusiasm. Much appreciated.